The millionaire walked into a cafe and saw his ex-wife with whom he broke up 25 years ago. But when he saw who was sitting next to her, the air outside was crisp, the late autumn breeze hinting at the arrival of winter. Mark Kensington barely noticed as he strode down the bustling city street, his steps brisk and purposeful. His mind was a constant buzz of figures and projections, his thoughts layered in plans, strategies, and ambitious goals. Mark Kensington, the millionaire, self-made, highly respected, and sharply dressed in tailored suits, rarely had a moment when he wasn't thinking about the next big deal or the next profit margin. This morning, however, he'd found himself with a rare free moment between meetings. A small, quaint cafe with warm lights spilling out into the street caught his attention. It wasn't his usual style. He preferred upscale lounges or chic restaurants with high ceilings and polished marble floors. But something about the simple charm of this cafe called to him, offering a pause from his frenetic world. After a moment's hesitation, he decided to step inside, seeking a quick reprieve from his demanding schedule. As he pushed open the door, a delicate chime echoed softly, and he was greeted by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the faint hum of quiet chatter. The place was modest, cozy even, with shelves lined with books and walls decorated with mismatched art. A warm sense of nostalgia seeped into his chest, catching him off guard. Mark moved to the counter, ordering a black coffee with a swift, practiced ease, his gaze briefly flicking over the small crowd. He was alone, wrapped in his bubble of wealth and influence, disconnected from the mundane lives that filled the room. It was almost refreshing, this fleeting anonymity. People here didn't recognize him, didn't whisper in awe or glance his way, awed by his expensive watch or his tailored coat. Here he was just another customer, simply a man in need of caffeine. As he collected his coffee, he found a table near the window, setting down his cup and pulling out his phone. His fingers instinctively moved to check his email. There was always another deal, another negotiation to examine. And yet, something urged him to pause, to set his phone down, just for a moment, and let himself relax. He watched people passing by outside, each a stranger with their own world of worries and dreams. It was strange how distant he felt from such simple things. Despite his wealth, or perhaps because of it, he felt an odd emptiness creeping in, an ache he didn't care to examine. He pushed it aside, deciding that he needed to center his thoughts. He'd built a life of unparalleled success, amassed a fortune most could only dream of, and yet... He took a deep sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth, letting it distract him. He reminded himself that he was here to take a breath, not to sink into brooding reflections. The cafe was filling up, more people gathering in groups or pairs, the sound of quiet laughter and murmured conversations weaving around him. He absently wondered what it would be like to be part of that world again, the one he left behind all those years ago. Not that he'd give up the life he'd built, of course, but sometimes the little things seemed appealing, if only for a moment. He glanced around the room, almost unconsciously, and then his gaze froze. Across the cafe, sitting by the window with a soft, serene smile on her face, was a woman he never expected to see again. His heart gave a sudden, sharp twist as recognition struck him. It was Lisa. The memories, buried under layers of time and ambition, suddenly flooded back, surfacing with a painful clarity. 25 years, a whole lifetime since he'd last seen her, and yet, there she was, as if no time had passed at all. Mark's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He was on the edge of something he didn't yet understand, something he couldn't turn away from. Mark's pulse quickened as he took in the woman across the room. Lisa looked different. More mature, of course, yet there was an undeniable grace about her, something he hadn't noticed back then, or perhaps he hadn't taken the time to see. She looked poised, comfortable, her eyes bright with a warmth that pulled him back to a time when things were simpler, when his days weren't governed by meetings and spreadsheets. But the shock of seeing Lisa wasn't what held his attention entirely. It was the person sitting beside her. A young man was seated at her table, leaning forward with an easy smile, as if they were sharing some private joke. The resemblance was undeniable. His hair, thick and dark like Mark's had once been, and his profile, with sharp angles that stirred something painfully familiar within him. He watched the young man laugh, saw the way Lisa's eyes crinkled as she joined in, their shared expressions casting a warmth over the scene, enveloping them in an intimate world of their own. Mark's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. Was this her son? Their son? The thought sent an unexpected pang through him, a strange blend of regret and curiosity. His memory sifted through the details of their past. Had she ever mentioned being pregnant? Had he left without knowing? Back then he'd been so consumed by his career, so driven by the singular focus of making it big. Lisa had always supported him, cheering on his successes, helping him through setbacks. But he'd given little in return. He hadn't noticed her sadness, her growing loneliness, until it was too late. The dreams of a family, a future together, had been something he'd told himself he'd get to, eventually. And then she'd left. He'd told himself he was fine, that it was a natural casualty of his success. They wanted different things, he reasoned, and she hadn't been able to handle his ambition. Over the years, he'd silenced the lingering guilt with work, with wealth, drowning out any whispers of remorse with all the trappings of luxury. But now, watching her across the room, the reality of his choices struck him. Here she was, living her life, and beside her was a young man who looked so much like the reflection he used to see in the mirror. Questions filled his mind. Was this young man his son? Had he truly missed out on knowing his own child? An impulse seized him, an urge to stand up and walk over to demand answers. But a strange fear held him back, a fear he hadn't felt in years. He was used to being in control, accustomed to command and respect. Yet here in this small cafe, the sight of his ex-wife with this young man left him feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since his youth. He wanted to know who this young man was. He wanted to know what Lisa had done with her life, how she'd moved on, and why she'd never reached out. But could he even face her? After all this time, what right did he have to barge into her world and disrupt the life she'd built without him? He took another deep breath, steadying himself as he fought the urge to approach her. What would he even say? The words seemed to tangle in his mind, the magnitude of his emotions too intense to sort through. He was a stranger in her life now, and she too was a stranger in his. But the longer he sat there, the stronger his curiosity grew. And with it, the faint, painful stirrings of regret. 25 years ago, Mark was a different man. Hungry, ambitious, and brimming with dreams of success. He and Lisa had met on a warm summer evening at a small neighborhood gathering, introduced by a mutual friend who'd been confident they'd hit it off. And indeed, from the moment Mark saw her, he was captivated. Lisa had a lightness about her, a way of bringing warmth and laughter to any room she entered, a kindness that softened his sharp edges. Where Mark saw goals and numbers, Lisa saw beauty and meaning, encouraging him to look beyond his rigid plans. Their relationship blossomed quickly. In those early days, they spent long, carefree nights under city lights, sharing their dreams and aspirations. Lisa was an artist at heart, working as a teacher in a local school while painting in her spare time. She spoke passionately of her students and the difference she wanted to make, and Mark had admired her for it. Though he didn't fully understand her passion, he saw the joy it brought her, and that was enough. Together, they had painted an idyllic picture of the life they would someday share, one filled with love, laughter, and the possibility of children. For a time, Mark allowed himself to dream of a life that went beyond his career. He even considered slowing down, something that felt foreign to him, just to savor their moments together. They talked about buying a house with a big yard and planting a garden. Lisa wanted a dog. Mark wanted a cat. They'd laugh about the small things and argue playfully about how they'd decorate. He loved those nights when they planned their future as if they had all the time in the world. But as his career gained momentum, so did his ambition. His company was growing and he was moving up the ladder fast. Promotions, raises, and opportunities came rolling in, each one more demanding than the last. Soon he was working late hours and traveling frequently. Lisa's quiet dinners at home became lonely as his work consumed more of his time and energy. When she tried to talk to him about it, he would reassure her, saying it was all for their future. The sacrifices, he insisted, were only temporary. First, Lisa believed him. She encouraged him, always cheering him on. She was his biggest supporter, helping him prepare for meetings, making his favorite meals when he came home late, leaving notes in his suitcase when he traveled. She'd always been his grounding force, his reminder that life was about more than titles and money. But he hadn't listened closely enough. He thought he had forever to make up for the long nights, the missed anniversaries, the moments that slipped through his fingers. The love they shared, though deep, was increasingly stretched thin by the demands of his career. And soon, the dreams they'd once woven together began to feel like distant memories. Lisa's laughter became a rare sound, her smile dimmer with each passing day. He noticed the changes, but instead of addressing them, he buried himself deeper in work, chasing the success he believed would bring them both happiness in the end. In his mind, he had convinced himself that she understood, that she shared his vision of success, that she'd wait until he could finally give her the life he promised. But looking back now, he realized that while he had been running toward his future, she had been left behind, holding on to a love that he'd thought would endure any distance. Mark closed his eyes, the cafe fading around him as he let himself linger in the memory of those days when love had felt limitless and unbreakable. The cracks in their relationship began as small, nearly imperceptible shifts. Lisa would wait up for Mark, her dinner growing cold as the hours ticked by, and he'd come home exhausted, too tired to notice her disappointment. Gradually, those quiet dinners turned into nights where she ate alone, falling asleep before he ever walked through the door. She tried to tell him how she felt, but he'd brush her concerns aside, saying it was all part of building a better future. Every time she expressed her loneliness, he'd reassure her that success required sacrifice, that everything he was doing was for them. But Lisa wasn't convinced. She longed for the simple moments they'd shared in the beginning, the laughter, the easy companionship, the certainty that he cared more about their happiness than any business deal. It hurt her to see him slipping further into his work, his gaze more often fixed on his phone or laptop than on her. She'd watched as the man she'd loved slowly transformed, his warmth and spontaneity replaced by a cold, singular focus on ambition. As time passed, her efforts to reach him became less frequent. The artist in her, once vibrant and inspired, felt suffocated by the emptiness that filled their home. She began staying later at her school, spending more time with her students, filling her life with purpose where she could. She found solace in her art, pouring her emotions onto the canvas in bold, expressive strokes, painting the things she couldn't bring herself to say. Their conversations dwindled to little more than routine exchanges. The love they'd once had, the one filled with whispered promises and hopeful dreams, was replaced by a hollow coexistence, like roommates rather than partners. Mark rarely noticed the silent erosion of their relationship, and even when he did, he convinced himself that it was temporary, that she'd understand once he reached the top. Then came the night that changed everything. It had been their anniversary, a date Lisa had marked in her calendar for months. She spent the entire afternoon preparing a special dinner, wearing a dress she knew he'd once loved, and setting the table with their best china. She waited, her heart heavy with hope that perhaps tonight he'd remember, that he'd walk through the door with flowers, or at least a smile that told her he still cared. But as the hours passed, her hope faded, replaced by a painful certainty. When he finally walked in, his face tired and preoccupied, he barely looked at her before muttering a quick apology. He'd forgotten their anniversary. In that moment, something within Lisa broke. She looked at him, standing there in his tailored suit, the man she'd once adored, and realized he was already gone, lost to a world that she would never belong to. She wanted to scream, to tell him that she couldn't keep waiting, that she was tired of loving a shadow, but the words felt pointless, drained of meaning by all the times he hadn't heard her before. The next morning, Lisa packed her things. She left a note, simple and direct, telling him she couldn't do it anymore. She needed a life with meaning, a life where she didn't feel invisible. She couldn't be with someone who was always chasing something just out of reach, who saw her as little more than an accessory to his success. When Mark found the note, he'd stared at it in disbelief. His initial reaction was anger, but deep down, he felt something more unsettling, a hollow ache that hinted at the consequences of his choices. And yet, even then, he brushed it aside, telling himself he was better off without her distractions. But now, sitting in the cafe, all those old emotions flooded back, sharp and unrelenting. He could no longer ignore the truth. He had lost Lisa because he had chosen ambition over love, and the cost of that choice was sitting across from him, a young man who might be his son, a stranger to him because he'd let the one person who mattered slip through his fingers. Mark watched Lisa from across the cafe, hardly able to believe she was real. The years had added a quiet elegance to her, an aura of calm and assurance that he didn't remember from their past. She looked different in ways he couldn't pinpoint. Her posture more upright, her movements more deliberate. Gone was the young, hopeful girl who had once believed in him unconditionally, who had trusted him with her dreams and her heart. In her place was a woman who seemed entirely self-possessed, as if she had long ago stopped seeking approval or reassurance from anyone. He found himself captivated, unable to look away. Every subtle gesture, every shift in her expression, seemed loaded with meaning, and he felt the weight of all the things he'd missed. For a moment, he tried to imagine what her life must have been like after he left it. How had she managed alone? He knew she'd moved on. It was clear from the way she carried herself. She seemed fulfilled, as if she'd found something deeper, something he still hadn't grasped. Mark noticed small details about her that he'd forgotten over the years. The way she tilted her head when she listened, the light that danced in her eyes when she smiled, the laugh lines around her mouth, the traces of age on her skin. They only seemed to enhance her beauty. She was no longer the young woman he'd known, but she was somehow more than that, as though time had distilled her into a clearer, more resilient version of herself. As he continued to watch her, he couldn't shake the feeling of loss creeping up on him. This was the woman he'd once dreamed of sharing a life with, the woman he'd envisioned by his side through every success, every triumph. In his mind, they were supposed to have grown old together, to have celebrated life's milestones with each other. But instead, he'd chased a different vision, one built on wealth and prestige, and in doing so, he'd abandoned a life that could have been filled with love and companionship. She didn't appear bitter or resentful, and for some reason that surprised him. He had expected, perhaps even hoped, that she'd be angry, that she'd harbor a trace of the hurt he'd left behind. But instead she seemed free, content in a way that made him realize just how shackled he still was to the material things he'd once thought mattered. Watching her now, he couldn't help but wonder if she'd found the happiness that had eluded him, the peace he'd sacrificed in his pursuit of success. A wave of emotions washed over him. Jealousy, admiration, even something that felt painfully close to envy. It was as if she had stepped into the life they'd once dreamed of, but without him, and she'd built it into something rich and meaningful, something that went far beyond the wealth he'd amassed. His success felt hollow in comparison, stripped of the significance he'd once assigned to it. And that young man beside her. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching the family he'd lost. The family that, had he chosen differently, he might have shared. A sense of profound regret settled over him, bringing with it the realization that all his achievements, all his millions, couldn't fill the empty space left by the life he'd abandoned. She had moved on, that much was clear. She was no longer his Lisa. She had become her own person, untethered from his influence. And he, a stranger now, could only look on from afar, feeling as though he were watching a version of his life he would never know. Mark's gaze shifted to the young man sitting across from Lisa, who was now talking animatedly, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. The man was in his early 20s, with a lean build and a youthful energy that radiated confidence and ease. There was something unmistakably familiar about him, an intensity in his eyes, the way he leaned forward when he spoke, as if he were passionately invested in every word he said. It was like watching a younger version of himself, And that realization hit Mark with a force he hadn't anticipated. He tried to piece together the young man's story, wondering about the life he'd led, the life he might have shared with him had things been different. Was this Lisa's son? Their son? The resemblance was undeniable, and Mark felt a surge of emotion, part pride, part sorrow. Here was a young man with so much potential, someone who might have inherited both his drive and Lisa's warmth, a combination that felt achingly bittersweet. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly connected to someone, and in this young man, he saw a glimpse of a connection that had been taken from him. All those years he'd spent alone, thinking he was making the right sacrifices, climbing higher on the ladder of success. Only now he realized what he'd sacrificed in return. And here, right before his eyes, was a young man who seemed to embody everything he'd once valued but had ultimately forsaken. Family, connection, and a sense of belonging. Mark's thoughts spiraled as he watched them. How much did this young man know about him, if anything? Had Lisa ever mentioned him? Did this young man even know he had a father who had once loved Lisa fiercely, who had dreamed of building a life with her before letting it all slip away? The questions gnawed at him, stirring up regrets he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. And yet, beyond the regret, there was a deep, unexpected longing, to know him, to reach out and introduce himself, to tell him that he mattered. He could feel an unfamiliar ache in his chest, a vulnerability that frightened him. For a man who prided himself on control, on never letting his emotions cloud his judgment, this overwhelming wave of longing and regret was almost unbearable. As Lisa laughed at something the young man said, Mark's mind wrestled with the reality of the scene before him. This young man wasn't just a stranger. He might be his son, the child he'd never known, a person who had grown up without his influence, without his presence. All the moments they could have shared, first steps, first words, birthday parties and late-night conversations, had unfolded without him. A sharp pang of jealousy coursed through him. He felt envious of all the people who had known this young man, who had shared in his joys and triumphs, watched him grow into the person he was today. That life could have been his, if only he'd made different choices, if only he'd valued what truly mattered before it was too late. The cafe, once a mere stop on his busy day, had become a window into a life he could never reclaim. He felt like an outsider, watching the world he'd once taken for granted, now moving forward without him. And sitting beside Lisa, the young man radiated a happiness and ease that told Mark he was loved, that he'd grown up in a world filled with warmth and belonging, the kind of world Mark had once dreamed of building with her. He took a deep breath, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. His coffee had grown cold, but he didn't care. He was no longer the man he'd thought he was. He was just a father who'd lost his way, watching from the sidelines as the life he'd left behind continued on, stronger and fuller than he'd ever imagined. Mark's gaze remained locked on the young man's face, his mind racing as he took in the undeniable familiarity of his features. There was no mistaking it now. The strong jawline, the slight arch of his eyebrows, the quiet intensity in his eyes. Mark's heart clenched as the realization dawned on him fully. This was his son, whom he had never met, never even known existed until this moment. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, pride, grief, and an aching sense of loss that made it hard to breathe. His son looked so much like him, and yet, he was a complete stranger. All the moments he'd missed washed over him in an agonizing wave. He thought of the milestones he'd never been a part of. The first words, the first day of school, the small, everyday victories and defeats that shaped a child into the person they would become. He'd missed it all, traded it all for the empire he'd built brick by brick, a fortress of wealth that now felt cold and hollow. Mark's mind drifted back to those early days with Lisa, the dreams they'd once had of a family, a future built together. He remembered the way she used to talk about wanting children, how she'd described the kind of mother she wanted to be. He had brushed her words aside back then, too focused on his ambitions to really listen, to understand the depth of her desires. Now, as he watched his son, a young man he barely knew, Mark felt the weight of all those missed conversations, all the dreams he'd let slip away in pursuit of his own goals. He'd believed he was building something meaningful, something that would make him feel complete. But now, faced with the reality of his son, he realized just how empty his achievements felt. A pang of guilt rose within him, sharp and relentless. He'd left Lisa to carry on without him, to raise their son alone. What kind of man does that? He wondered, his own image of himself as a proud, successful millionaire crumbling in the face of this newfound understanding. He felt like a stranger to himself, ashamed of the choices he'd made, the life he'd valued over family. But along with the guilt, there was something else, a glimmer of hope, fragile but unmistakable. He felt an urge to know his son, to bridge the chasm that separated them, to somehow make up for the years he'd lost. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew he couldn't simply step into this young man's life and expect things to fall into place. But the desire was there, a deep, unshakable need to reconnect, to build something real with him if he would allow it. As he continued to watch them, Mark noticed the way Lisa looked at their son, with pride, with love, with a tenderness that spoke of years of devotion and sacrifice. He realized then the full extent of what he had missed. He had spent years chasing success, believing it would bring him happiness, fulfillment. But seeing his son now, he understood that true success lay in the very thing he had abandoned. A knot formed in his throat as he wondered if there was still a chance, if he could somehow forge a relationship with his son despite all the lost years. He didn't know how to begin, what words to say, or how to face the resentment that might await him. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away this time. He couldn't leave without trying, without at least telling his son who he was, and why he hadn't been there. Mark braced himself, heart pounding, as he contemplated the steps he would take. For the first time in years, he felt fear. Fear of rejection, of facing the consequences of his choices, of stepping into a world he had chosen to abandon. As Mark sat there, a wave of guilt crashed over him, sharp and unrelenting, as he confronted the harsh reality of his choices. The wealth, the power, the luxury, all those things he'd spent a lifetime accumulating, now felt painfully insignificant compared to the bond he'd lost. The weight of his decisions settled heavily on his shoulders, and he felt as if he were seeing his life clearly for the first time. Every dollar he'd earned, every deal he'd closed, each step toward his meticulously crafted success felt empty when compared to the young man before him, the son he'd never known. It was a realization that sent a chill through him, an awareness that struck at the core of who he was. What he had considered triumphs were, in the harsh light of hindsight, hollow victories. And the price he'd paid for them was a life filled with empty achievements, leaving him estranged from the one thing that could have truly mattered. He remembered with painful clarity the times he'd chosen work over the possibility of family, the moments when he'd told himself he was too busy to worry about relationships. He'd silenced any misgivings, convincing himself that his success would be worth it in the end. But now, sitting alone, watching his son and his ex-wife share a quiet laugh, he felt the devastating truth. He had been wrong. Success hadn't filled the void, hadn't given him the sense of purpose or fulfillment he'd expected. It had only widened the chasm within him. Images flashed through his mind, moments he had missed, glimpses of the life he might have had. He imagined what it might have been like to hold his son for the first time, to see him grow, to teach him the things he'd learned. He pictured birthdays, holidays, simple afternoons spent together, memories he'd never made, moments he'd lost forever. It was an unbearable thought, realizing that he had turned his back on all of it without even knowing what he was giving up. The hardest part was the recognition of Lisa's strength, her resilience in raising their son alone. She had become everything he hadn't, patient, loving, devoted. Watching her now, he could see how her love and care had shaped their son into a confident, joyful young man. She had done what he had failed to do. She had prioritized what truly mattered, while he had chosen ambition over love, success over family. Regret settled over him, heavy and unyielding like a stone in his chest. He wondered if he even had the right to feel this way, to wish for a connection that he had walked away from. What kind of father abandons his child before he even knows him? What kind of man sacrifices his family at the altar of ambition? He could feel his shame growing, a dark shadow that seemed to encompass him entirely. For the first time, he saw himself not as the successful, powerful man he had believed himself to be, but as a flawed, deeply lonely person who had let the most important things slip through his fingers. He felt small, broken, undeserving of the love he had forfeited, and he wondered if it was even possible to make amends. Could he ask his son to forgive him for years of absence? Could he face Lisa, knowing how deeply he had hurt her? A part of him wanted to turn and walk out of the cafe, to leave before he risked exposing himself, before he faced the reality of the family he had abandoned. But a stronger part of him, the part that felt the overwhelming pull of love, a love he hadn't realized until now, kept him rooted to his seat. He couldn't leave. He had to try, no matter the cost, no matter how painful it might be. As he took a shaky breath, Mark knew there was only one path forward, and it was one he should have taken years ago. He would gather his courage and confront the family he had lost. This was his moment to at least try, to finally choose love over ambition, no matter where it led him. Mark's heart raced as he rose from his seat, the weight of decades pressing on him as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the table where Lisa and his son sat. The bustling sounds of the cafe faded, leaving him in a silence that was somehow more intense, more deafening. This wasn't a business meeting, a negotiation, or a performance review. This was real, raw, and utterly vulnerable. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure of whether he was about to fall or finally take flight. As he approached, he caught a few fragments of their conversation. The young man, Alex, he learned from Lisa's laugh, was animatedly sharing a story, his hands moving expressively, eyes alight with excitement. And Lisa, gazing at him with a look of quiet pride, nodded along, her smile tender and understanding. It was a scene of perfect simplicity, an unguarded moment that spoke of years of shared memories and love. Mark felt like an intruder, an outsider in the life they'd built without him. He hesitated, his mind scrambling for the right words, the right way to bridge the gap he'd created all those years ago. But no words seemed adequate. How could he, in a single conversation, make up for years of absence, for the choices that had kept him from knowing his own son? He took a deep breath, forcing himself to take the final steps toward their table, his heart pounding as he drew closer. Lisa noticed him first. Her expression shifted from one of contentment to surprise, her eyes widening as she recognized him. He saw a flash of emotions pass across her face. Shock, confusion, perhaps even a hint of anger. But there was something else too, a lingering softness, a faint echo of the connection they'd once shared. She recovered quickly, her face settling into an unreadable expression, as if she were preparing herself for whatever was to come. Alex looked up then, following his mother's gaze, his bright eyes curious as he took in the stranger standing before them. Mark could see the flicker of recognition in his son's face, as if something about him seemed familiar. It was a strange moment, the silence between them filled with a tension that neither Mark nor Alex fully understood. "Lisa," Mark managed, his voice quieter than he intended, weighted with the emotions he couldn't quite put into words. He struggled to keep his composure, the vulnerability raw and unfamiliar. "Hey, I didn't expect to see you here." Lisa's eyes remained steady, assessing him, and Mark could feel her holding back. He could tell she was searching for the right words, perhaps battling her own emotions. She looked from Mark to Alex and then back, her expression softening just slightly, as though she recognized the fragility of the moment. "This is unexpected," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of steel. "Mark, what are you doing here?" He cleared his throat, feeling exposed under her steady gaze. He glanced at Alex, who was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, the faint lines of confusion on his young face. I didn't know I'd see you today," Mark admitted, his voice rough. He felt foolish for not having a better answer, but he pushed forward, realizing this might be the only chance he'd have. I saw you both and I wanted to come over. To introduce myself. He looked directly at Alex, swallowing the emotions that threatened to choke him. My name is Mark Kensington. And I believe I'm your father. The words hung in the air, a raw confession that left Alex's eyes wide with shock. Lisa's mouth slightly parted as she took a slow, deep breath. It was a moment suspended in time, fragile and heavy with the possibility of both forgiveness and rejection. For a long moment, the silence between them was absolute, filled only by the soft background hum of the cafe. Mark could see the surprise etched on Alex's face, his brows furrowing as he looked to Lisa for confirmation. Lisa, steady and calm as always, held her son's gaze, then turned to Mark with an expression that was both resigned and wary. Alex, Lisa began softly, her voice as gentle as he remembered. This is Mark. He's the man I told you about. She paused, as if searching for the right words. Your father. Alex blinked, his expression unreadable as he took in the revelation. Mark could see the flicker of emotions in his son's eyes. Curiosity, confusion, maybe even a hint of anger. Alex took a deep breath, crossing his arms as he finally looked back at Mark, sizing him up. You're my father? Alex asked, his tone a mixture of disbelief and guarded emotion. I've gone my whole life without hearing from you. Why are you here now? The question, simple yet devastating, hit Mark like a punch. He had expected it, prepared for it even, but the bluntness of it still left him grasping for a response. How could he begin to explain the years of silence, the choices that had led him down a different path? He could feel the weight of his own guilt, the regrets that had festered over decades, but he forced himself to meet his son's gaze, unwilling to look away. Alex, I don't have an excuse, Mark began, his voice cracking slightly. There's nothing I can say to justify why I wasn't there for you. I made choices I thought were important, but I can see now how wrong I was. I'm here because I saw you and I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't keep pretending I hadn't made a mistake. He glanced at Lisa, who was watching him with an expression that held both sadness and understanding. She nodded slightly, as if urging him to continue. Mark took a steadying breath, feeling the vulnerability of his words, knowing they might be too little too late. I know this doesn't make up for anything, Mark continued, his voice thick with emotion. I know I missed everything, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that I wasn't there for you, that I left Lisa to do this on her own. But I want to try if you'll let me. I want to know you, to be in your life. If you want me to. Alex's expression softened, though his posture remained guarded. He exchanged a glance with his mother, as though seeking her input, her reassurance. Lisa gave him a small, encouraging nod, her hand reaching across the table to give his a gentle squeeze. Mark felt his chest tighten as he watched the small exchange, the quiet intimacy between mother and son that he had never been a part of. He realized in that moment just how much Lisa had given to their son, the sacrifices she'd made to ensure he felt loved, secure and whole. Alex turned back to Mark, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. I don't know you, Alex said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that belied his years. But I do know how much my mom did for me. She's been there for everything. And part of me resents you for not being there. But he paused, glancing at his mother, who nodded gently. I think I'd like to get to know you, Alex said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. But it'll take time. And it has to be real. I don't want you to just show up and disappear. Mark's throat tightened with emotion. He nodded, his voice rough as he replied, I promise. I'll do whatever it takes. I know I can't erase the past, but I'll do everything I can to be here now. I won't let you down again. A flicker of understanding passed between them, tentative and fragile but real. And for the first time in years, Mark felt a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption, a possibility to rebuild what he had lost, brick by careful brick. After their conversation, Mark left the cafe feeling like he'd shed the weight of years in a single afternoon. He strolled slowly through the streets, the bustling city around him fading as he reflected on all that had happened. A whirlwind of emotions churned within him. Relief, hope, but also a deep sadness for the time he had lost and could never regain. He realized that for all his achievements, the life he'd built had been one-dimensional, a world filled with material wealth but devoid of the true connections that made life meaningful. He thought of Lisa's face, her calm, patient expression as she had listened to him. She had every right to be angry, to shut him out, to tell him that he was too late, that the door had closed long ago. And yet she had allowed him a chance, not just with Alex but with her as well. Her forgiveness, however tentative, had been like a salve to the wounds he hadn't even known he carried. It had shown him a glimpse of the life he could have led if he'd chosen differently, if he had valued love and family as much as he had once valued his career. A pang of regret twisted in his chest as he wondered what it would have been like to build a family, to share the simple, unremarkable moments of everyday life. His son's milestones, first steps, scraped knees, late-night talks, each one a memory he would never have, a part of Alex's life he could never reclaim. But he could start now. He could begin to mend what was left, even if the process was slow and uncertain. For the first time, Mark let himself face the pain and loneliness he'd been ignoring, the consequences of having lived so far removed from what truly mattered. He saw the irony in his life, the paradox of having everything he thought he wanted, yet feeling emptier than ever before. He'd spent years convincing himself that success was the only thing that mattered, that love and family were distractions he could return to later. Now he understood how deeply wrong he had been. The mansion, the luxury cars, the high-rise office, they were shadows, hollow achievements compared to the love he had so carelessly abandoned. He took a seat on a nearby bench, staring out at the city skyline, his thoughts slowly coalescing into a kind of clarity he'd never experienced. His wealth could never buy back the lost years, nor could it repair the wounds he'd inflicted. But perhaps he could still build something new. Something grounded in humility, gratitude, and a genuine desire to be present in the lives of those he loved. He wanted to know his son, to be there for him, to support him in the ways he hadn't before. He wanted to share in Alex's dreams, to be someone his son could look up to, not as a distant figure of wealth, but as a father who cared deeply. Mark knew the journey ahead would be challenging, filled with moments of vulnerability he had once avoided. But he was willing to face those fears, to bear the pain of accountability if it meant he could build a real connection with Alex. His heart felt raw, open, but it was a feeling he welcomed. For the first time in years he felt alive, connected to something beyond himself. As he sat in the fading light of the city, he made a promise to himself. He would not let this chance slip away. He would become the father Alex deserved, the man he himself could be proud of. And though the road would be long, he felt the first stirrings of a new purpose, one far richer than any achievement he'd ever known. The days following that fateful afternoon at the cafe marked the beginning of a journey unlike any Mark had ever taken. Each morning, he rose with a renewed sense of purpose, yet the path ahead was fragile, paved with both anticipation and an underlying fear that his son might find his efforts too little too late. Every day, he wrestled with the fear of rejection, the worry that he might not be able to make amends for all the lost years. Yet he knew that rebuilding a relationship with Alex would take patience, humility, and a genuine openness that he'd never allowed himself to show before. With Lisa's help, he and Alex arranged a lunch date for the following week. When the day arrived, Mark found himself nervous, his mind racing with thoughts of what he should say, what he could possibly offer this young man he was only beginning to know. But as he watched Alex approach, carrying himself with an ease and confidence that reminded Mark of Lisa's grace, he felt an unexpected calm wash over him. This was his son, a stranger in many ways, yes, but someone with whom he now shared a deep and irrevocable bond. Their conversation was slow and cautious, but over the course of the afternoon, something remarkable began to happen. They shared stories, laughed at the awkwardness of the moment, and Mark found himself marveling at the person Alex had become. He listened intently as Alex spoke about his interests, his plans and his future, absorbing each detail with the reverence of someone granted a second chance. There was a bittersweetness in every word, every smile, but for the first time, Mark allowed himself to feel it fully without turning away. As their relationship grew, so did his connection with Lisa. She'd kept her distance at first, cautious, protective of the life she had built, and he couldn't blame her. But little by little, they began to find a new rhythm, a fragile but real friendship based on mutual respect and the love they both shared for their son. Mark came to understand that while he had been pursuing wealth and status, Lisa had been the true architect of their son's life, providing the warmth, stability, and support that Mark had once neglected. One evening, after dropping Alex off at his apartment, Mark found himself sitting in his car, contemplating all he'd experienced. He understood that there were things he couldn't change, memories he couldn't rewrite, but he felt a quiet hope stirring within him. Each moment spent with Alex, each conversation shared, was like a step toward redemption, a way to rebuild a bridge he had once carelessly burned. In time, Alex grew to trust him more, letting Mark into his life bit by bit. They shared dinners, caught movies, even took a weekend trip together, during which Mark saw glimpses of his younger self in Alex. Ambitious, driven, and full of dreams. But unlike Mark's younger self, Alex had something Mark had missed: a deep understanding of love, loyalty, and the importance of family. And Mark was grateful for that. Grateful that, despite his absence, Lisa had instilled these values in their son, creating a foundation that he could now build upon. Through it all, Mark realized that he was no longer striving to win back the family he'd lost, but rather to be worthy of the family that had allowed him back in. Redemption, he learned, wasn't something that could be achieved with grand gestures or sweeping apologies. It was found in the quiet, daily commitment to be present, to listen, to love with humility and grace. Years later, as he sat at a holiday gathering with Alex and Lisa, Mark felt a profound sense of peace. He'd come to understand that true wealth wasn't in his bank account or his portfolio, but in the laughter around him, the warmth of shared meals, the forgiveness that had allowed him back into this circle of love. Mark looked across the table at his son, who smiled back at him with a kindness he hadn't earned but was determined to repay. In that moment, he knew he'd been given the greatest gift of all: a second chance to love, to grow, and to finally be the man his family deserved.